The bright morning sun streamed through the airport terminal windows as a young 12-year-old boy clutched his boarding pass, his eyes wide with wonder. This wasn't just any ordinary day. It was his first time ever stepping foot on an airplane, and the excitement bubbling inside him was almost overwhelming. His mother, standing protectively beside him, smiled warmly as she watched him count down the gates until they reached their designated boarding area. The boy had earned straight A's all semester, and this trip to his grandmother's 70th birthday celebration felt like a well-deserved reward. He'd spent countless hours watching airplane videos on YouTube, learning about takeoffs and landings, and even memorizing the safety procedures. His backpack was perfectly packed with his favorite book, headphones, and a special card he'd made for his grandmother. As they waited in the boarding area of Southwest Airlines Flight 2507, the boy couldn't help but bounce slightly on his toes, watching the ground crew prepare the aircraft through the large terminal windows. He'd specifically requested a window seat weeks ago when his mother booked their tickets, dreaming of watching the clouds pass by and maybe even spotting their city from above. The boarding process began smoothly enough. They were in boarding Group A, thanks to his mother's careful planning. Walking down the jet bridge, the boy's heart raced with each step. The distinct smell of airplane cabin air hit him as they stepped aboard, and he politely greeted the flight crew with his brightest smile, just as his mother had taught him. Finding their row was easy. They'd been assigned seats 14A and 14B. The boy slid into his window seat, immediately peering out at the bustling airport operations below. His mother stored their carry-on bags in the overhead compartment and settled into her seat beside him. Everything felt perfect, just as they'd planned. Other passengers filtered past them, filling the remaining seats on the plane. The boy pulled out his phone to take a quick photo of his first view from an airplane window, wanting to document every moment of this special day. His mother helped him adjust his seatbelt, making sure it was secure but comfortable. The familiar announcements began over the intercom, and the boy mouthed along with some of the safety instructions he'd memorized from his research. His mother squeezed his hand, sharing in his enthusiasm. The morning sunlight continued to stream through the small oval window, creating patterns on their laps as they waited for the final passengers to board. That's when a flight attendant approached their row, her expression stern and her posture rigid. The boy's bright smile began to fade as she stopped directly beside them, a shadow falling across his carefully chosen window seat. Something in her eyes told him that his perfect first flight was about to take an unexpected turn. The anticipation in the air shifted to tension as the flight attendant cleared her throat, her gaze fixed on the young boy who was still clutching his precious window seat boarding pass. The other passengers around them continued their usual pre-flight routines, unaware that they were about to witness something that would soon capture the attention of millions across the country. Little did anyone know that what happened in the next few minutes would not only change this boy's life, but would spark a nationwide conversation about compassion, dignity, and the importance of treating every passenger with respect, regardless of their appearance or background. The events that were about to unfold would prove that sometimes the most powerful stories of change begin with a simple plane ride. The flight attendant's voice cut through the gentle hum of pre-flight conversations like a sharp knife. "There seems to be a seating issue here," she announced, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The boy looked up at her with confusion in his eyes, then glanced at his mother, who was already reaching for their boarding passes. "Is there a problem?" his mother asked calmly, her voice steady despite the sudden tension. She held out their boarding passes, showing the clear assignment of seats 14A and 14B. The documentation was perfect. They'd checked in exactly 24 hours before the flight to secure these specific seats. The flight attendant barely glanced at the boarding passes before responding. "We need to move him to a middle seat," she stated flatly, gesturing to the boy. "It's airline policy." Her words hung in the air, feeling oddly out of place since several other young passengers were comfortably seated by windows throughout the cabin. A passenger across the aisle looked up from his laptop, his brow furrowed. He'd noticed that just moments ago, another family had settled into their window seats without any issues. The boy's mother noticed this too, but maintained her composure, knowing her son was watching how she handled the situation. "Could you please explain this policy?" the mother asked politely, her hand protectively resting on her son's shoulder. We specifically booked this seat weeks ago, and my son has been looking forward to his first flight experience." The boy sat perfectly still, his earlier excitement now replaced with a growing knot in his stomach. Instead of answering the reasonable question, the flight attendant's demeanor grew increasingly hostile. "If you're going to be disruptive, I'll need to call security," she threatened, despite the fact that both mother and son had remained perfectly calm and respectful. By this point, other passengers had started to notice the unfolding situation. A businesswoman 2 rows ahead pulled out her phone and began recording discreetly. A retired teacher seated behind them shook his head in disbelief, watching as this young boy's dream first flight turned into a nightmare. The boy, showing remarkable maturity for his age, spoke up softly. "Mom, maybe I should move," he whispered, not wanting to cause any trouble. But his mother, while still maintaining her dignity, stood firm. "No, sweetheart. There's nothing wrong with sitting in the seat we paid for." The flight attendant pulled out her phone and made a quick call. Within minutes, 2 airport security officers appeared at the entrance of the plane. The other passengers watched in stunned silence as this situation escalated far beyond what anyone could have expected. What happened next would be captured on at least a dozen cell phones, as passengers couldn't believe what they were witnessing. The boy, who had done nothing wrong, who had been nothing but polite, who had simply wanted to look out the window on his first flight, was about to become the center of a story that would touch hearts across the nation. The security officers moved down the aisle, their presence casting a shadow over what should have been a joyful morning. Tears welled up in the boy's eyes, but he blinked them back, determined to stay strong like his mother had taught him. Other passengers began to speak up, their voices rising in protest at the unfair treatment they were witnessing. Nobody knew it yet, but those next 7 minutes would change everything, not just for this boy and his mother, but for the entire airline industry. Sometimes the most powerful moments of change come from the most unexpected situations, and what was about to unfold would prove that justice can arrive in the most surprising ways. The security officers reached their row, their presence casting a heavy shadow over the morning's excitement. "What seems to be the problem here?" One of them asked, looking between the flight attendant and the family. The boy sat perfectly still in his window seat, his hands folded neatly in his lap, trying his best to appear calm despite his racing heart. The mother spoke first, her voice clear and steady. "We're seated in our assigned seats, which we booked weeks ago. My son has never flown before, and we specifically chose this window seat for his first flight experience. The flight attendant is insisting he move, but won't explain why." More phones came out among the passengers, recording the scene. A gentleman in a business suit spoke up from across the aisle. "I've been watching this whole thing," he said to the security officers. "This family has done absolutely nothing wrong. They're being singled out for no reason." The flight attendant's face flushed red as she insisted to the officers they're being disruptive and refusing to follow crew member instructions. This statement caused a ripple of disbelief through the cabin, as everyone nearby had witnessed the family's calm and respectful behavior throughout the entire interaction. A kind-looking grandmother type a few rows back couldn't stay quiet any longer. "I've been on this flight since Dallas," she called out, "and these people have been nothing but polite. This is discrimination, plain and simple." Murmurs of agreement spread through the cabin. The boy looked out his window one last time, watching as another plane took off into the morning sky. He'd dreamed about this moment for weeks, but now all he felt was embarrassment and confusion. His mother's hand found his, squeezing gently, reminding him that they would face this together. The security officers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. One of them pulled out his phone, presumably to contact a supervisor. The other passengers continued recording, their faces showing a mix of anger and disbelief at what they were witnessing. A young college student sitting behind them had been live-streaming the entire incident to her social media followers. "This is happening right now on Southwest Flight 2507, she narrated quietly into her phone. "They're trying to remove a young boy from his rightfully assigned seat for no valid reason." The flight attendant's supervisor appeared at the front of the plane, quickly making her way down the aisle. She took in the scene, the calm family, the concerned passengers, the multiple recording phones, and her agitated colleague. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. The boy, showing wisdom beyond his years, turned to his mother and whispered, "It's okay, Mom. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy." His words, overheard by nearby passengers, brought tears to several eyes. Here was a child teaching adults about dignity and grace under pressure. What happened in the next few moments would not only change the course of their day, but would spark a movement that would reach far beyond this single flight. As the supervisor assessed the situation, nobody realized that this incident was already going viral on social media, spreading across the internet faster than any airplane could fly. The clock was ticking, and in just 7 minutes, everything would change. Sometimes the most powerful lessons about justice, dignity, and standing up for what's right come from the most unexpected teachers, in this case, a young boy who simply wanted to look out an airplane window. The supervisor stood in the aisle, her eyes moving from the boarding passes to the family, then to her agitated colleague. The whole plane had fallen silent, waiting to see what would happen next. The morning sun continued to stream through the window, casting long shadows across the cabin. "I understand there's an issue with seating?" the supervisor asked, her tone professional but cautious. She could see the numerous phones recording the situation and the faces of concerned passengers all around. The boy's mother handed over their boarding passes once again, her hands steady despite the stress of the situation. "We have properly assigned seats," the mother explained, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet cabin. "My son has never flown before. We specifically booked a window seat for his first flight experience, and now we're being told to move without any explanation." The flight attendant cut in, her voice higher than before. "They're being difficult about following crew instructions," she insisted, but her words were met with immediate protests from nearby passengers. The businessman across the aisle stood up, despite the fasten seatbelt sign. "That's absolutely false," he stated firmly. "I've been watching this entire interaction. This family has been nothing but polite and cooperative. They're simply asking for an explanation about why they're being forced to give up their assigned seats." The boy sat quietly, his school backpack still tucked neatly under the seat in front of him. Inside was the birthday card he'd made for his grandmother, decorated with carefully drawn airplanes because he'd been so excited about his first flight. Now those same drawings felt like they were mocking him. The supervisor checked her tablet, scrolling through the passenger manifest. Everything was in order. Their seats were properly assigned, their boarding passes were valid, and there was no legitimate reason for the requested move. She looked uncomfortable as she glanced at her colleague. "Sir," the supervisor addressed the boy directly, "would you and your mother please gather your belongings?" The boy's heart sank, thinking they were about to be removed from the flight. But then she continued, "We'll be upgrading you to our business class section at the front of the aircraft." The flight attendant's face turned an even deeper shade of red. But, she stammered, realizing things weren't going as she'd planned. The other passengers began to applaud, their approval echoing through the cabin. The boy looked at his mother, uncertain. "Really?" he whispered. She squeezed his hand and nodded, but before they could move, the supervisor raised her hand for attention. "Additionally," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I want to apologize to both of you, and to all our passengers who witnessed this incident. This is not what our airline stands for, and there will be a full investigation into what happened here today." The college student who had been live-streaming quickly updated her followers. "You won't believe this. The supervisor just arrived and everything's changing." Her video had already been shared thousands of times, and people across the country were tuning in to watch events unfold in real time. As the boy and his mother gathered their belongings to move to their new seats, other passengers reached out to pat his shoulder or whisper words of encouragement. The flight attendant who had caused all the trouble was quietly asked to exit the aircraft. The look on her face showed she finally understood the gravity of her actions. What no one on the plane realized was that this was just the beginning. In the next few minutes, as their story continued to spread across social media, something even bigger was about to happen. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even, it's about creating positive change that affects everyone. The story of what happened on Flight 2507 spread across social media like wildfire. The college student's livestream had already reached over 100,000 viewers, and clips of the incident were being shared rapidly on every major platform. But what happened next would take everyone by surprise. In the airport terminal, just minutes after the incident, a well-dressed man in a crisp suit approached the gate counter. He'd been watching everything unfold while waiting for his own flight. "I'm a civil rights attorney," he told the gate agent, "and I need to speak with that family immediately." Meanwhile, in their new business class seats, the boy was finally starting to relax. The flight attendants in this section couldn't have been kinder, bringing him a special first flight certificate and letting him visit the cockpit before takeoff. His mother sat beside him, scrolling through her phone in amazement as messages poured in from friends who had already seen the videos. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing a slight delay in departure. What none of the passengers knew was that in the terminal, airline executives were scrambling. The videos had reached their corporate headquarters and emergency meetings were being called. The airline's reputation was on the line and they needed to act fast. Back in the main cabin, passengers were still discussing what they'd witnessed. The grandmother who had spoken up earlier was showing her seatmate comments from the viral video. "Look at this," she said. "People are calling for a complete overhaul of airline training procedures." This could change everything. The businessman who had defended the family was typing away on his laptop, drafting an email to his corporate office. As a frequent flyer who logged over 100,000 miles annually, his voice carried weight with the airline's management. He was determined to ensure this incident led to real change. Outside the plane, the story continued to grow. News vans were already pulling up to the airport, alerted by the viral social media posts. Reporters were requesting statements from the airline, and civil rights organizations were pledging to investigate the incident. The boy, unaware of the storm he had inadvertently sparked, was finally getting to enjoy the experience he dreamed about. From his new seat, he had an even better view of the runway. A kind flight attendant had brought him a pair of plastic wings, which he proudly pinned to his shirt. In the corporate offices of the airline, phones were ringing nonstop. The CEO himself was watching the viral videos, his face growing more concerned with each passing minute. This wasn't just about one flight anymore, this was about the entire airline industry and how it treated its passengers. Social media hashtags were trending. Hashtag flight quality and hashtag justice in Theskis were being shared thousands of times per minute. People weren't just angry, they were demanding change. Stories from other passengers about similar experiences were flooding the comments sections. The attorney in the terminal had managed to make contact with the airline's legal department. His words were clear and firm. "This isn't going away with a simple upgrade to business class. We need systematic changes to prevent this from happening to anyone else." 7 minutes after the initial incident, the airline's PR team released their first statement. But it wasn't the usual corporate speak about investigating the situation. Instead, it was something unprecedented, a commitment to immediate action and reform. What started as one boy's dream of his first flight had transformed into something much bigger. In just 7 minutes, the power of social media, combined with the courage of everyday people who stood up for what was right, had set in motion changes that would affect air travel for years to come. Inside the airline's corporate headquarters, emergency meetings were in full swing. The CEO paced back and forth in the conference room, watching multiple screens displaying the viral videos and social media reactions. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from board members and media outlets. "Get me connected to that flight," he demanded, his voice firm but controlled. The PR team scrambled to establish a direct line to the plane, which was still at the gate. This wasn't just another customer service issue, this was a moment that could define the airline's future. Meanwhile, on the aircraft, the boy was sharing his window view with a younger passenger who had come up from economy class to say hello. Despite everything that had happened, his natural kindness shone through. His mother watched proudly, amazed at how her son had handled himself throughout the ordeal. The flight attendant who had caused the incident was now sitting in the terminal, that head in her hands. Security footage from the past 6 months was being reviewed, revealing a pattern of similar behavior that had gone unreported. Her actions today had finally brought everything to light. The supervisor returned to the business class cabin with a satellite phone. "The CEO would like to speak with you," she said softly to the mother. Other passengers watched in amazement. It was rare for the CEO of a major airline to get personally involved in a situation like this. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was really just minutes, Flight 2507 was ready for takeoff. The plane began to move, and the boy pressed his face against the window of his business class seat, watching as the ground began to move beneath them. His first flight was actually happening, though not quite the way he'd imagined it. The airline's response had been swift and comprehensive. While the plane taxied to the runway, corporate emails were flying back and forth. The CEO had already approved an immediate action plan that would reshape the company's approach to customer service and employee training. In the main cabin, passengers were still buzzing with excitement about what they'd witnessed. The college student who had live-streamed the incident was now reading comments from her followers aloud to her seatmate. Messages of support were pouring in from around the world, with people sharing their own stories and celebrating the positive changes that were already beginning. The flight supervisor walked through the cabin, personally thanking each passenger who had spoken up during the incident. She paused at the businessman's seat, who had been one of the first to defend the family. "Your voice made a difference today," she told him. He smiled and replied, "Sometimes staying silent is the same as accepting what's wrong." As the plane lifted off the ground, the boy grabbed his mother's hand, his eyes wide with wonder. This was the moment he'd been dreaming of, watching the earth fall away as they climbed into the clouds. The earlier troubles seemed to fade as the excitement of flight took over. Back at the airline's headquarters, the PR team was putting the finishing touches on their official statement. But this wasn't going to be just another corporate apology. The airline was announcing immediate changes, mandatory monthly training sessions for all staff, a new passenger advocacy program, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. The civil rights attorney, still in the terminal, was receiving calls from other airlines. They wanted to be proactive, to learn from this incident and implement changes before similar situations could occur on their flights. What started as one airline's crisis was becoming an industry-wide movement for change. The grandmother who had spoken up during the incident was writing a long email on her phone, describing what she'd witnessed to her own grandchildren. "Today, I saw what courage looks like," she wrote. "It looks like a young boy who stayed calm in the face of unfairness, and a mother who stood up for what was right." Social media continued to explode with activity. The hashtags were now being used to share positive stories of airline employees who had gone above and beyond to help passengers. It was as if people were hungry for good news, for examples of how things could be better. The boy's mother received a notification on her phone. The airline had already processed full refunds for their tickets and issued lifetime premium status cards for both of them. But more importantly, they had invited them to be part of a new passenger advisory board to help shape future policies and procedures. Looking out at the clouds, the boy sketched a quick drawing on his napkin. It showed an airplane with people of all kinds sitting together, smiling. The flight attendant serving their section asked if she could take a photo of the drawing. "This," she said, "is what flying should be about." What had started as an attempt to remove them from their seats had instead removed barriers and sparked real change. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even, it's about making sure nobody else has to go through the same experience. 1 week after the incident on Flight 2507, the story was still making waves across the country. Major news networks had picked up the story, not just focusing on what went wrong, but highlighting how the response had created a movement for positive change in the airline industry. The boy and his mother were invited to appear on a morning talk show. They chose to decline being on camera, wanting to keep their privacy, but agreed to a phone interview instead. The boy's words, spoken with simple honesty, touched millions of listeners. "I just wanted to look out the window and see the clouds. Now I get to help make sure everyone gets to see the clouds if they want to." The airline industry was experiencing a remarkable transformation. The incident had sparked a national conversation about how passengers were treated. Other airlines weren't waiting to be caught in similar situations. They were proactively reviewing their policies and implementing changes. A major airline association held an emergency meeting to discuss industry-wide standards. Representatives from every major carrier attended, bringing with them stories from their own passengers and ideas for improvement. The boy's drawing of people sitting together on an airplane had been enlarged and hung in the conference room, serving as a powerful reminder of their purpose. Training programs were being completely redesigned. Instead of just focusing on procedures and rules, they now included extensive sections on empathy, cultural awareness, and the importance of treating every passenger with dignity. Flight attendants were sharing their own experiences, helping to build a more understanding and inclusive environment. The college student's livestream had grown into something bigger. She started a website where passengers could share their stories, not just negative ones, but positive experiences too. It became a platform for highlighting the many airline employees who went above and beyond to help their passengers. The businessman who had spoken up during the incident was invited to join a corporate advisory board. His first suggestion was simple but powerful. Let's stop thinking of passengers as seat numbers and start remembering they're people with dreams and stories of their own. In airports across the country, new signs began appearing. Everyone deserves a window seat on their first flight. It became a symbol of something larger, the idea that everyone deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of who they are or where they're going. The grandmother who had witnessed everything wrote an opinion piece for her local newspaper. She described how proud she was to see young people standing up for what was right, and how it reminded her of other moments in history when small acts of courage led to big changes. Support groups for airline employees began forming, providing spaces where they could discuss challenging situations and learn from each other. The focus wasn't on punishment but on understanding and growth. Many workers shared how the incident had opened their eyes to unconscious biases they hadn't realized they carried. The civil rights attorney who had stepped forward that day was now working with multiple airlines to develop new standards for handling passenger complaints. What we're seeing, he told reporters, is an industry finally ready to acknowledge its problems and actively work to solve them. Meanwhile, the boy had finally made it to his grandmother's birthday celebration. When he told her the story, she hugged him tight and said, "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of courage." Her words would later be quoted in training materials used by airlines across the country. 1 month after the incident that changed everything, the boy stood at a podium in a crowded hotel conference room. He had been invited to speak at a youth leadership conference about his experience. His mother watched proudly from the front row as he adjusted the microphone to his height. "I never wanted to be famous," he began, his voice clear and steady. "I just wanted to see the clouds from above. But sometimes life has bigger plans for us." The room fell silent, hundreds of young people leaned forward to hear his story. The airline industry had undergone remarkable changes in just 30 days. The once problematic flight attendant had been let go, but more importantly, she had written a public letter acknowledging her mistakes and encouraging others to examine their own biases. Her letter became required reading in airline training programs. The airline's new youth advisory board, with the boy as its youngest member, had already made significant improvements. Their first recommendation was simple: creating a first flight certificate program that made every child's first time in the air special, regardless of where they sat. During the conference breaks, other young people came up to share their own stories with the boy. Some had faced similar situations, not just on planes, but in schools, stores, and restaurants. They all agreed that his story had given them courage to speak up when they saw something wrong. The business class upgrade they'd received that day had turned into something much more meaningful. The airline had created a new Dignity and Respect initiative, ensuring that every passenger was treated fairly. Flight attendants were now evaluated not just on their service skills, but on their ability to make all passengers feel welcome and valued. Back at the airline's headquarters, the wall of the main lobby had been transformed. A huge mural showed diverse groups of people boarding planes, all with the same excited smiles the boy had worn before his first flight. Below it, in simple letters, was written, "Every journey matters. Every passenger counts." The college student who had live-streamed the incident was now running a successful social media channel dedicated to sharing stories of positive change in the travel industry. She often featured airline employees who went above and beyond to help passengers, showing that one person's kindness could make all the difference. The civil rights attorney had helped draft new industry-wide guidelines that were being adopted by airlines across the country. What happened that day wasn't just about one flight or one airline, he explained in an interview. It was about recognizing that we all have a responsibility to make the world a little better. As the boy wrapped up his speech at the conference, he shared the drawing he'd made on the plane, the one with people of all kinds sitting together, smiling. It had been turned into the logo for the airline's new training program. "Sometimes," he said, The best revenge is making sure nobody else has to go through what you went through. The grandmother who had spoken up on the plane was in the audience too. After the speech, she hugged the boy and told him, "You've taught us all that courage doesn't have an age limit." Her words would later be engraved on a plaque in the airline's training center. 1 month had passed, but the impact of those 7 minutes continued to grow. What started as one boy's dream of seeing the clouds had become a movement that touched countless lives. And as he looked out at the audience of young faces, he knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger.